Eight Bad Men and True by Ralph Bergengren. This is recorded to celebrate the 8th anniversary of LibriVox. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. In a low groggery, where the eagle above the bar looked as if it had died of delirium tremens and been stuffed for fun by an intoxicated taxidermist, 8 fashionably dressed men smoked, drank, and fidgeted in a stew of impatience around a rum-stained table. It was a tough place. There was nothing tougher in the 1820s along the New York waterfront. And to any acute observer, these fretful men were the toughest things in it. It is enough to say that all the regular frequenters eyed them admiringly and kept at a safe distance. They were, in fact, pirates, and their curly-brimmed beavers, their excellently tailored but somewhat ill-fitting swallow-tail coats, their satin neckwear and their gold-headed canes testified, oh horror, to the exquisite taste of gentlemen passengers robbed and murdered at sea on their way from London. Whatever else they might seem, no ordinary policeman would have guessed the briny nature of their lawless occupation, but the awed whisper of it had gone round the Stuck-Pig Oyster Palace. Even there, at that period, it was a rare treat to see 8 real pirates together. "The way I looks at it, messmates," one of this brutal but interesting group was saying, "be as we've waited day arter day for Billy Slant Eye till it ain't much use to wear out shoe leather a-looking or pants a-sitting." He was a burly creature whose tanned nose jutted from between his fine red whiskers like a gnarled log just going over the brink of a raging waterfall. "As the pooty motter says it, together we stands up and separate we falls over. If Slant Eye had a listened to me, instead of histing his anchor and setting sail up town all by hisself, we'd all be aboard the Polly this minute, and maybe a chasing of a cute little packet." Smoke filtered moodily through his whiskers, and beside him a lank, sunburnt, devil-may-care companion in a dove-coloured swallow-tail nervously rapped his front teeth with the rim of his large brass nose-ring. "For my part, gentlemen all," he remarked between rappings, "I'm getting sick and tired of waiting and watching. What I wants now be to put to sea and rest my feet and eyes shivering." "If you axes me, Whisker," drawled a tall, graceful miscreant, graceful in a snake-like way, absently drawing a neat wet geometrical design on the table with the end of his long, handsome yellow moustaches, dipped for the purpose in his rum and water. "I'd say as a week ashore be the best we can do for him. Lost he be, poor feller, and nothing left for us but to pipe a little shanty and all hands aboard ship." It was a sensible suggestion. Ungrateful as pirates usually were, every cruel eye looked him a thank ye, and every heartless head nodded approval. Salt water deep under keel, the untamable wind, the flying quarry, the blood-dabbled deck, and the indescribable pleasure of dividing other people's personal property, these were their natural element. As for the Stuck-Pig Oyster Palace, it was all right in its way, but one tough place is very much like another. When you've seen one, you've seen all of 'em. A week was enough of it. But they knew also that every sodden eye in the Pig was looking at them, and that pirates were expected to burst at intervals into wild and roaring ditties. The snake-like beauty dried his moustaches carefully on a delicate lace handkerchief with somebody else's initials, and they all cleared their throats with gurgling swallows of rum and water and began to roar good-naturedly, "Let the good ship roll like a tortured soul on the devil's frying pan, as we drag on deck by the scruff of his neck.
the timid gentleman. As we hauls by the heels, a dame has squealed, "Oh, oh, please let me go." We remarks, "To feed the sharks in the tossin' deep below." Oh, you bet $1, the more they holler, the more they kick and fuss, as pair by pair they walks on air, the more of a lark for us. It was a fine, satisfying, saltish ditty. A stranger who had just entered waited politely until they had finished, and then crossed the sanded floor of the palace. He also was dressed like a gentleman, albeit rather a seedy one, and he carried himself with the erectness of a man who is afraid that sooner or later the weight of his stomach will tip him over. "Red whisker," said the stranger politely, "yellow moustaches, nose ring. I think I am not mistaken." He felt in his pocket. Instantly 8 pirates were on their feet, and 8 hands had vanished simultaneously under as many coat-tails. Had the fellow produced anything less innocent than a card-case, he would have been shot before he knew it in 8 different places. He hummed Yankee Doodle, so might Daniel have hummed a popular Babylonian tune in the den of lions, as he extracted a card and laid it on the driest spot of the table. One after another the pirates studied it. Any schoolboy could have made a bluff at reading "Hubert Irvington Hubertson, attorney at law, innocents protected at reasonable rates." But these were no schoolboys. None of them knew from what peaceful, cultivated homes the remote, insistent call of the sea might have lured the others, but they had all heard and answered too early to enjoy the enforced advantages of a public school education. Most of us, fortunately, are compelled to go to school, but these men had escaped it. Words of 1 syllable were their limit, and perhaps Mr. Hubertson knew it, for he smiled understandingly. "My friend and client, Billy Slant-Eye," continued Hubertson, carefully exploring another pocket, "told me I would probably find you at the Stuck Pig. Fortunately, events justify prophecy. I have a letter from him. Unfortunately, he is now occupying, temporarily, I hope, cell 42 in the city prison." No diplomatist could have presented his credentials better. The number of the cell was immaterial, but the place was exactly where their missing comrade might naturally have landed. And this cool, corpulent, helpful-looking stranger was evidently his friend and confidant. He found the letter, drew up a chair, and resumed his rendition of Yankee Doodle, as Red Whisker slowly deciphered their mate's message. "Dear friends and good messmates all, I take my pen in hand to tell you that this fine fat fellow is my at or knee. That means he is an expert at the law, but do not fear him for that. He is the kind of expert who knows how to defeat the law, and that is what we need now. Yes, my dear friends, I am in a cell. My door is barred. I broke my 1 chair, and so I must sit all day on my tiny bed, my head in my hands and my eyes on my feet. Now and then a tear will trickle down in my mouth and make me think of when I was free and swum with you all in the great salt sea. I think the sea is like a big tear shed by all the poor men who weep in jails. This is how I got in jail. I was in a crowd before a window, when a thief near me stole the watch and chain from an old man. The old man almost caught the thief. Then, to my great surprise, the thief gave me the watch and chain quick, and ran out of the crowd. But I kept my head. I put the watch and chain down my neck and ran too. But, alas! the poleys caught me before I could get to the stuck pig, and they took me to jail. My friends, I was like a wild boar with rage. The first thing I did was to take my chair in hand and wait for the turnkey when he came to give me food. When he came, I whirled my chair round my head and got him good and hard just where your backbone stops at your neck. That is the place to hit a man with a chair. He fell with a short, sick sob. His neck was broken. So was my chair. If I had thought of that, I would have hit him with my little washstand. You need a chair so much more than you do a washstand. My hat or knee heard of the watch and chain and came to help me out. When he heard of the turnkey, he said, oh dear, this is worse and worse. Then he thought long and said, was you alone when you did this crime? I said, yes, alone with the turnkey. Then he said, in that case I might get you off with my expert skill, but I fear it would cost more than you could pay to save your neck this time. Then I told him the kind of men we are, and how all we need to do for cash is to dig some up. So here he is, and that is how it is with me. I will die game if I must, but you are just as dead if you die game as if you break down and kick and sob and tear your hair. He says he can get me off with your help, so trust him and do as he says, and all may yet be well with your sad but hopeful friend, Bill Slant-Eye. P.S. I am too brave to fear, but oh, I hate to be hung. I am too young. I am too young. B.S.E. Any way they looked at it, it was a pitiful letter, exuding something of the cold, damp atmosphere in which it was written. They almost saw him sitting on his tiny bed and composing it painfully on his little washstand. "Stealing of a watch and killing of a turnkey," said Red Whisker thoughtfully. "And ye think, mister, as ye're smart enough to get him off in it?" Mr. Hubertson tried unsuccessfully to cross one leg over the other. "I don't boast, gentlemen," he replied with a simplicity that inspired confidence. "But it was the misfortune of Cain that he couldn't have me for his attorney." 2. In the court, tense with the accumulated suspense of a capital trial, Lawyer Hubertson was nearing the eloquent end of his address to an intelligent jury of 4 incorruptible citizens and 8 pirates. Spectators, packed like human sardines in the oil of morbid curiosity, held their breath as they listened. The quill pens of the press scratched in chorus, and the 8 pirates, fresh from deep water and unused to jury duty, scuffed their feet nervously. Juries in those days were rather carelessly chosen. Of the 36 citizens who had been summoned for this trial, 8 had changed hats, coats, and identities with as many total strangers outside the court-house. Pirate gold and the expert skill of Mr. Hubertson did it, and 24 had agreed to sit silent during the empanelling of the jury until these total strangers, answering for the first 8 of them, had filed to the jury box. It was bull luck for the prosecution that the remaining 4 places went to the 4 citizens whom Mr. Hubertson had found absolutely incorruptible. Among the witnesses, the old gentleman whose watch had been stolen mopped his face with a silk bandana and shook his head weakly like a victim of senile dementia.
but few spectators pitied him. Their sympathy was for the poor man in the dock. As Mr. Hubertson had well said, a saint who looks like a criminal is far more to be pitied than a criminal who happens to look like a saint. "The defence," Mr. Hubertson was saying, "does not deny that this old man, at some period of his useless life, may have owned a watch. You have heard him testify that his father gave him one. I believe it. His father is dead. One must believe something. You have heard him confess, with a reluctance that has not been without its significance, that he lost that watch. And you have followed my conscientious efforts to elicit from him beyond a reasonable doubt when, how, and where he obtained another. He has forgotten. He does not know. He does not remember. He is by no means certain. He refuses to answer. Driven at last into a corner, he snarls that he still believes the watch in this case to be his personal property. Why, gentlemen, he does not even know the number. 11497, a child would remember it, of the timepiece he has the unblushing effrontery to come here and testify was stolen from him by this defendant." Mr. Hubertson paused, took a drink of water, and let the significant facts sink slowly into his hearers. Even without pirates on the jury, it would have been a remarkable trial, for the energy, imagination, and acumen of Mr. Hubertson had exploded bomb after bomb in the camp of a district attorney who had made the natural mistake of not taking the case with sufficient seriousness. The facts were too obvious. The prisoner had no witnesses. He had been caught with the watch. Nobody else could have killed the turnkey. Press and public were indifferent to him. The first day of the trial had been almost without spectators. Mr. Hubertson would delay justice, lose his case, and pocket a fee for doing so. The court knew him as a petty criminal lawyer of rather flamboyant imagination. What it did not suspect was that, for the first time in his career, Mr. Hubertson was properly financed. The legal record familiar to students of law as 9 Puff, New York, 1345, People v. Toadhunter, believes to this day that Slant-Eye's real name was Obadiah Toadhunter, that he had come to New York from Violetdale, New Hampshire, that he enjoyed chewing a straw, and that the rusty camphor-smelling black coat and high uncomfortable collar in which his attorney presented him to the jury were the best clothes, and this in itself was pathetic, worn hitherto only at weddings, funerals, corn-huskings, and other innocent village dissipations. There was then no telegraph from New York to prove that there was no Violetdale in New Hampshire, nor any system of police communication by which a startled district attorney could quickly locate the real township from which Mr. Hubertson had produced the quaint old country folk who now sat timidly together on the yellow settee reserved for witnesses. No witnesses for the prisoner. These were his witnesses, and they were real country people. There shone the genius of Hubert Hubertson. Anywhere you might have seen it, the group would have been touchingly venerable, except for Obadiah's girlish sweetheart, Priscilla Eaton, and Miss Eaton would have made any man who was a man feel like taking her in his arms and comforting her. The very presence of these old folks from home had jumped the case into the public eye and heart, and crowded the court on the second morning. As the Evening Gazette had said in an editorial, "Justice must be blind. The innocent must suffer with the guilty. Yet we should esteem ourselves less than human if we did not hope that the tender instinct of these fine old Violetdalians will be justified, and that evidence may yet be forthcoming to refute testimony that is, so far, largely circumstantial. No case, in short, could have been going better for the defence, and nothing clouded the satisfaction of Mr. Hubertson except the behaviour of his 8 pirates. Like all born orators, Mr. Hubertson was keenly sensitive to the mood of his audience. He liked to feel his hearers following his thought like sunflowers following the sun. And nothing is more distressing to such a mind than an audience that scowls, whispers, and scuffs with its feet. Of course they knew he was lying, but that should have made them all the more appreciative of the grand style in which he was doing it. "And now, gentlemen," went on Mr. Hubertson, "who, I ask you, does remember the number of this watch? The defendant's white-haired father, who gave it to him on his 21st birthday. His gentle aged mother, who helped pick it out. The venerable men to whom he showed it, pointing to the number with that natural pride that we all feel in our first watch. And to whom did this good young man show it? To no tavern companions, but to the fine old clergyman who had baptized him Obadiah in the Second Baptist Church of Violetdale, and to the stern, gentle, time-worn doctor who had saved him from measles and whooping cough, childish distempers from which we have all suffered. You will say," he added with a contemptuous glance at the district attorney, "that Miss Eton did not remember it. I grant you that. Yes, I grant you that. I make no charges. I only state without hesitation, as these gentlemen will state in the sacred seclusion of their incorruptible jury, that I or you, Mr. District Attorney, or any one of us, being a stranger in New York and feeling alien fingers, old or young, tugging at his watch-chain, would drop his watch down his neck and hurry from such a dangerous neighbourhood." "Which don't hide from me," whispered Juryman Red Whisker to Juryman Yellow Moustaches, "as it were the old feller's watch to start with." "And now, gentlemen," resumed Mr. Hubertson, "I might make a joke and say that I turn from watch to turnkey." "An accursed poor specimen, now you got it out," muttered Juryman Yellow Moustaches. "But this is no time for humour." "It's time for a drink," whispered Juryman Nosering to his next neighbour, "and a long time over." "You will no doubt argue that any one of us, thrown into a gloomy cell on the absurd charge of stealing his own watch, would lose his temper and assault the turnkey, fatally if possible. But you will decide also whether such an assault was actually committed. There was no witness. I cannot summon the turnkey before you. I am not Gabriel." "And a putty one you'd make, cuss ye," muttered Juryman Yellow Moustaches. "If I were Gabriel, I would blow my trump, call that unfortunate official to the witness stand, and ask him one question. Did you, or did you not, on entering this defendant's cell, trip, fall, and strike your head fatally against a chair?" It was a pertinent, surprising question, and the way he put it made most of his hearers see him, a fat, side-whiskered Gabriel, white-robed and blowing. In the jury box, Tarbosh, Sullivan, Doodleberg, and Weeks, the 4 incorruptible citizens, sat rigid with conscientious attention. But it jarred Mr. Hubertson to see that the rest of the jury fidgeted even in the presence of Gabriel. Glad as he was to have them there, He again wished heartily that they were either not so nervous or would be polite enough to conceal it. Nothing had completely held their attention but the testimony of the old folks from home, and especially Miss Eaton's prettily bashful relation of her engagement to Obadiah. Probably, thought Mr. Hubertson, they had no taste for oratory, as some men have no real feeling for the cornet. But the least they could do was to look a little more as if they believed what he was saying. The important thing, however, was that Tarbosh, Sullivan, Doodleberg, and Weeks hung on his words with a flattering attention.
"My learned brother,"
he resumed with an indignant glance at the pirates that at least stopped their whispering,
"smiles to think that this conclusive evidence is impossible. Let him not be too certain. You, gentlemen, can summon that witness, not by the discredited arts of the magician, but by sheer intellect. You, gentlemen, can evoke that scene as it must have happened with a toad hunter, not as it might have happened had I, for example, been the prisoner. You know, for you have heard this wise old physician testify, that Obadiah Toadhunter could not bear the sight of blood. He fainted if he cut his finger. And you have heard this aged father testify that he could not beat, I repeat his own words, spoken with what sincerity of remorseful tears we have all witnessed, he could not beat, thrash, pummel, or otherwise persuade his tender-hearted son into killing a potato-bug. Obadiah Toadhunter could not kill potato-bugs. Does it need a miracle, gentlemen, to convince you, beyond reasonable doubt, that he could not kill turnkeys? Or do you need the turnkey to tell you how, on that fatal evening in the half-light of that gloomy cell, he tripped and fell, breaking the chair, breaking his neck, and, except for you, breaking the life of this fine young husbandman, his aged father and mother, his oldest friends, and last but not least, this sweet girl, graduate of Violet Dale High School, who I see has again swooned from the excess of her natural emotions." He sat down, visibly overcome by his own emotion, and Judge Bean, rising behind his desk, cleared his throat preparatory to charging the jury. 3. In the smoky jury-room, 12 stern men — sternness was about the only quality they had in common — agreed to consider the turnkey first and the watch afterward. On this count Judge Bean had charged them with his usual dry judicial common sense. The prosecution, he said, claimed that Toadhunter had waited, chair in hand, for his victim. If they believed the prosecution, they would find Toadhunter guilty. The defence, he added, said the turnkey had tripped, fallen, and broken his own neck. If they believed that, they would find Toadhunter innocent. And now the jury had been out 5 hours. 19 ballots, each obstinately repeating "guilty 8, not guilty 4, had already been taken. There they stuck, 4 incorruptible citizens on one side and 8 pirates on the other. As Yellow Moustaches characteristically put it, what in the were they going to do next? "I'll sit here and die of thirst,"
said Juryman Red Whisker doggedly,
"afore I'll toddle back in that courtroom and be made a laughing stock. Any fool can see aslant I Toadhunter killed the turnkey. And as for his silly family, what you seems to think so much on, Mr. Tabosh, you take it from me as they'll be better off without him." "They don't think so,"
said Mr. Tarbosh, an honest man with a thin beard and an indomitable obstinacy.
"But the important fact to me is that Toadhunter's father couldn't make him kill the potato bugs. You can't get round it. As the twig is bent, gentlemen, so is the tree inclined. Nothing will ever convince me that that man could commit murder."
"You take it from me, Tarbosh," said the juryman Nosering keenly, "if the cuss wouldn't kill potato bugs, it weren't because his heart stopped him. It were his stomach. Maybe it made him feel sick like to see the little fellers go squash." And he blew 6 triumphant puffs of smoke straight through his pendant nose ornament. Truly, it was a scene and situation quite unlike what Mr. Hubertson had anticipated, and yet he was directly responsible. Skilfully as he might forecast the effect of Violetdale and oratory on incorruptible citizens, yet men with hearts in their bosoms, Mr. Hubertson had never before addressed a jury of pirates, men without hearts in their bosoms, proud of it, and likely, if anything, to be repelled and disgusted by any obvious appeal to that flabby centre of feminizing emotion. From his point of view, 8 jurors were safely accounted for. At the worst, disagreement was certain, and he had, so to speak, spit on the palms of eloquence and gone hot foot after Tarbosh, Sullivan, Doodleburg, and Weeks to make sure of acquittal. He had convinced Tarbosh, Sullivan, Doodleburg, and Weeks, but he had also, up to a certain point, convinced Red Whisker, Yellow Moustaches, and their evil associates. If you have no heart, there are your eyes, ears, and keen native intelligence. He had convinced them, almost from the beginning, that they were a remarkably brainy and patriotic jury. He had convinced them that Slant-Eye's real name was Obadiah Toadhunter. They had known nothing of Slant-Eye's youth or antecedents. His name might easily enough have been Toadhunter. And they had been uninformed of Mr. Hubertson's intentions. Almost before they knew it, they had swallowed the old folks from Violetdale, swallowed Miss Eton, swallowed the potato bugs. And in proportion as they digested these morsels, they had lost Slant-Eye, whom they had known and loved for his bloodthirsty and unsentimental character, in a Toadhunter who frankly made them extremely tired. The one thing they had not swallowed was that Obadiah Toadhunter had not killed the turnkey. There they knew better, and every mushy effort of Mr. Hubertson to make them believe the contrary, for they forgot completely that he was not really addressing them, had insulted their new-born self-respect as jurymen, and increased their hostility to his straw-chewing client.
"So here we sit, 12 uncommonly brainy men,"
snarled a short, stout pirate, whose irregular brown face and small knobby nose gave him an almost comic resemblance to the chosen prey of the insect under discussion.
"And what I axes is, be we a tryin' of this cussed assassin for killing a potato bug, or be we a tryin' of him for killing a turnkey?" "We are not trying of him at all," said Mr. Tarbosh with coldly sarcastic emphasis. "We are examining evidence, and when his own father testifies that he couldn't—" It was a hopeless discussion. It went round and round like a happy child on the flying horses, and came back each time just where it started. It accomplished nothing but to make a man thirsty. Red Whisker, Yellow Moustaches, Nosering, and the wretch whose appearance suggested a cruel but intelligent potato, looked again at their watches, muttered between their teeth, and glanced with savage despair at the door and windows. The 4 other pirates had sensibly gone to sleep, sarcastically leaving instructions to call them in time for the next ballot. A locked door, barred windows.
Although they had Tarbosh, Sullivan, Doodleberg, and Weeks right there in the room with them, they knew better, face to face as they had just been with the grim and awful majesty of a judge sitting on a bench, than to yield to natural impulse, spring upon their fellow jurymen, and tear their incorruptible limbs from their incorruptible bodies. No way out of it but to make them see by peaceful persuasion that Toadhunter deserved hanging. After that they might get a chance at Hubertson, who had said nothing whatever about this absurd practice of locking men up to talk things over. And with nothing to drink but water. "When I was with Jackson at New Orleans," said Mr. Sullivan suddenly, perhaps remembering that it was at least 20 minutes since he had modestly mentioned his war record, "one of our men fell out of a window and broke his neck. I put the fact forward for what it is worth." Mr. Weeks drummed on the table to attract attention. He leaned forward. He had something so important to say that, command himself as he might, he could hardly say it. "It strikes me as worth a good deal," he exclaimed forcibly. "Follow me now closely. Putting together what this gentleman has suggested about squashing potato bugs, and what this gentleman tells us of his personal observation of a man breaking his neck from a fall, I don't see really how we can escape two conclusions. First, the prisoner might have killed the turnkey. Second, the turnkey might have killed himself. Gentlemen, I think we are getting nearer a solution." Red Whisker spat out a bitter and complicated oath, perhaps the most shocking that has ever before or since been heard in a jury-room. His quick, resourceful mind saw clearly that they were not getting nearer a solution, were, if anything, farther away than ever. He grasped his passions in one strong hand and rubbed his head violently with the other. "Tarbosh, Sullivan, Doodleberg, Weeks," he studied them savagely through half-closed eyelids. Nothing, evidently, would convince the numbskulls but some tangible proof, the inevitable conviction of an eye-witness. Well, they should have it. He laid his pipe carefully on the table, pushed back his chair with a hideous squeak that awoke his sleeping companions, dragged his chair across the room, and stood it up forcibly in the corner. Then, grinding his teeth steadily behind his quivering whiskers, he paced 6 paces from the chair, and marked the place with a guilty ballot. Then he stopped grinding his teeth long enough to articulate. "There's the chair," he said briskly, "and there's the door of the cell where they locked the cuss up. If any gentleman in this room can fall over that ballot and manage to break his neck a-hitting that chair, I'll vote not guilty. And what's more," he added, as no one rose eagerly to try the experiment, "I'll show ye myself as it ain't possible." At that tense moment, as often happens when 12 intelligent men strive to penetrate through a fog of conflicting evidence to the lighthouse of truth, not one of them thought of Obadiah Toadhunter. He had become a case. He had no aged parents, no girlish sweetheart. He had never been baptized by one venerable man and saved from measles and whooping cough by another. The whole grave problem, discussed as it were in the very shadow of the gallows, simmered down to one practical question. Would or would not this forceful juryman break his neck? The 7 pirates looked worried, but well they knew that no human power could stop their comrade as he backed slowly to the far end of the jury-room. The conscientious faces of Tarbosh, Sullivan, Doodleberg, and Weeks beamed already with the ineffable expression of men who told you so. "Here I goes, gentlemen," cried Red Whisker warningly, and added with fine sarcasm, "If I breaks my neck, I points Mr. Tarbosh to throw my little vote at the next election." Without another word, he hurled himself chairward. Truly had Mr. Hubertson said that by sheer intellect they would be able to summon the turnkey into their jury-room. He reached the ballot. He left the floor. For what seemed a long time, they saw the twin soles of his shoes supported, like a modern aeroplane, only by the speed of his indomitable propeller. And then, at last, the shocking thud of a falling body and the crash of splintered furniture. Even Mr. Tarbosh had to admit beyond a reasonable doubt that no turnkey could have hit a chair harder. 4. Everybody in the court stood up like one man and woman. Twilight was falling. Here and there a lamp had been lighted, and Judge Bean was again taking his place on the bench. He was a small, dignified justice, his bench presumably hidden somewhere behind his high desk. And when he sat down on it, he looked, from some parts of the courtroom, exactly like a human head cut off and left on the desk until somebody should call for it. Opposite this legal head, and beyond the legal furniture where the clerk of the court shuffled his papers and the district attorney consulted with his assistants, Mr. Hubertson chatted with his client, doubtless consoling him for the absence of Mr. and Mrs. Toadhunter, Miss Eton, the Reverend Mr. Hopkins, and good old Dr. Hooper. Spectators whispered to each other that no wonder the old folks from home were unable to bear the strain of hearing the verdict. Poor dears, they had been through enough already. Yet it was rather a pity they were not present. Without them something would be lacking of the supreme emotion that the pale, expectant audience had been waiting all day to experience. Little they guessed that Mr. Hubertson was humming Yankee Doodle under his breath, perfectly certain that the return of the jury at this hour could mean nothing short of acquittal. Nor did they imagine, how could they, the mental ditty to which Obadiah Toadhunter was complacently chewing his straw.
The first time as ye kills a man, it makes ye kinder ill. Ye feel so hot ye needs a fan, and then ye has a chill. The second one he ain't so bad, although he's painful too, for killing allus makes ye sad until ye've killed a few. But when ye've killed a score of men, you're gettin' used to it. The 21st ye slaughters then don't bother ye a bit. And arter that, it's pooty time, ye hardly stops to think, for killing men is just the same as taking of a drink.
The unconcern of the man Toadhunter, writes Judge Bean in his interesting chapter, My Experience with the Criminal Toadhunter, an Explanation. See Memories of Bench and Bar, J. Q. Bean, interested me greatly. He was genuinely cheerful. He seemed actually to regard the forthcoming verdict as something amusing. As I have said already, in a long experience with depraved and criminal types, Toadhunter was the most evil-looking man, with the possible exception of 7 or 8 of the jury, that I had ever seen in the dock. I disliked him immensely. He was a murderer, if ever I saw one, wide-jawed, frowsy-headed, and with a Mongolian cast of countenance strongly emphasized by the oblique position of the cruellest eyes I have ever looked into. When those eyes were on me, I confess to feeling like a mouse under the surveillance of a cat, or, to be more exact, as such a mouse might feel if endowed with my own keen critical intelligence. During the trial he eyed me with increasing malice, as was proved afterward that the ignorant fellow held me personally responsible for his unpleasant predicament. A door at the right opened. The jury filed to their places. Anybody could see that the conscientious men had been having a hard time of it. 4 were pallid with their awful responsibility, 7 as pallid as their tan permitted. The 12th, his complexion hidden by his magnificent red whiskers, showed a black and blue lump about the size of a small egg on his forehead, which he fingered delicately to find out whether it was still swelling. It had been a hard bump, but it had done the business, convinced Tarbosh, Sullivan, Doodleberg, and Weeks, upset the nice-laid plans of Mr. Hubertson, and was about to hang Obadiah Toadhunter. Altogether the 8 pirates glanced with grim satisfaction at their former comrade. And from the dock Slant-Eye smiled back at them, a confident, joyous, happy, contented, come-and-let-us-murder and rob together again smile that brushed away every Hubertsonian cobweb, and revealed him to them, the same old Slant-Eye, a worse man, if possible, and a better pirate than when he had been arrested. One after another, so rapidly that the result was instantaneous, their wicked minds reverted to the time before the trial, and horror, consternation, and despair spread like warm butter over every sin-toasted countenance. What, after all, did his parents matter? They saw him, in swift imagination, hanging like so much bacon, and nothing under him but hundreds of smiling, upturned, interested faces. And it was they who had done it, with their little ballots. The clerk of the court was speaking, putting the formal question, was Obadiah Toadhunter guilty, or was he not? Somewhere somebody dropped a pin, and everybody else heard it. "Guilty," said Foreman Doodleberg. The word issued reluctantly from his pale, firm lips, rose to the ceiling, circled the court-room, fluttered into the very corners, a black word, followed by a profound and seemingly eternal silence. "And so say you all, gentlemen of the jury?" asked the clerk solemnly. To an amazement from which he never fully recovered, 8 of them answered at the same moment. "Him guilty?" sneered Yellow Moustaches contemptuously. "You bet we don't, old feller!" shouted Nose Ring defiantly. "No such cussed fools as that!" howled the human potato. "Doddlebug's a liar!" bellowed the juryman with the bump. "What we agreed were as he's as innercent as a nuttin' lamb, poor feller." And with his bump still throbbing, he caught Foreman Doodleberg by his conscientious neck, and began shaking him with all the fury of his accumulated desire for rum and water. Rarely, if ever, in a court of justice, has a jury experienced a change of heart so soon after bringing in a verdict. And still more rarely has 2/3 of the jury started in to pummel and shake the remaining jurymen. They had long wanted to get their strong, anxious hands on Tarbosh, Sullivan, Doodleberg, and Weeks. Now they would satisfy that lust whatever happened, and they did it so thoroughly that no one else for the moment dared get within reach of them. The scene focused attention on the jury box. On the crowded benches a lady spectator hysterically giggled herself off into a dead faint, and sat senseless and, what was worse, unseeing, between 2 others so interested in the jury that they didn't even know she had fainted. Lawyers, court officials, policemen hovered around the jury box. The space between judge and prisoner was completely emptied. On 3 sides of the prisoner the cage rose higher than his head, but it was only waist-high on the side nearest the bench. And at the moment when he fully grasped Mr. Doodleberg's verdict, Obadiah Toadhunter, unnoticed in the succeeding excitement, had begun climbing over this insufficient barrier. "I had been watching the prisoner closely," writes Judge Bean, "at the moment when the jury returned its verdict. His jocose expression instantly vanished. He paid no attention whatever to the surprising riot that ensued among the jurors. His eyes were on me, and he instantly threw one leg menacingly over the rail in front of him. Although I promptly called attention to what he was doing, the court officers, busy with the disgraceful scene now going forward in the jury box, paid no attention. It was evident that I must deal with Toadhunter myself. I spoke to him quietly, but with authority. "Go back into the dock, Toadhunter," I said firmly. "Go back, go back, 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 back." This command I emphasized by looking at him steadily. "Back," I repeated. "Back, back, back." I could see that my bearing affected him, for I have considerable will-power. Nevertheless, he continued to advance steadily. I say steadily. The reader must remember that these events took place faster than the calm pen of retrospection can now chronicle their indelible impression. Quick as a wink, as the saying is, Toadhunter was out of his cage and across the space that separated us. My own desk was quite high. I had counted upon it to hold him until my voice and will combined to drive him back, conquered, to his place in the dock. Unfortunately, the man was remarkably agile and acrobatic. I had hardly commanded him a dozen times to go back when he rose like a sky-rocket from the other side of the desk and came down on all fours directly in front of me. Evidently I had miscalculated the time necessary to get him under complete control, and now the dignity of my position forbade me to grapple with the fellow in physical combat. I remembered that there was usually a policeman at the court-house entrance, and I decided to decoy Toadhunter in that direction. Therefore I reversed my formula. "Come on," I said, as I extricated my person from my coat, left the garment in the hands of the prisoner, and vaulted nimbly over the fairly high rail at the right of the bench. The witness-stand was before me. I cleared it in the manner of children when they play leap-frog, and ran lightly into the judge's corridor. Still repeating, "Come on," I led him swiftly along the corridor, down the stairs, and so to the entrance. But I was disappointed to find that the policeman had stepped away for a few moments. Practically considered, the time between Red Whisker's assault on Mr. Doodleberg and Slant-Eye's arrival on Judge Bean's desk could have been only a few seconds, certainly less than half a minute. But, busy as he was, the resourceful Red Whisker saw what had happened and passed a quick word to his equally busy companions. Hardly had Judge Bean leap-frogged the witness-stand, hardly had Obadiah Toadhunter leap-frogged it after him, before Red Whisker had given Mr. Doodleberg a complicated and painful farewell shake, and was over the jury rail. Nosering followed, Yellow Moustaches pursued Nosering. It was like the circus when the entire company jump over the elephants, except that here none of the performers turned somersaults. The air of the court, in a bee-line from the jury box to the judge's corridor, was full of jurymen. It was the only available exit from that crowded courtroom, and yet, for a moment, no observer could guess what they were doing or why they were doing it. The corridor swallowed them. 5. 3 hours later, in the cabin of a small, rakish-looking schooner, steadily holding a seaward course down the harbour, 9 wicked but cheerful men sat cosily at dinner.
"And maybe the luckiest thing of all,"
said Red Whisker contentedly.
Where a slant-eyed toad hunter recognised the little wagon as they totes ye off to jail in. There she were, a-waiting for us when we chases of the jedge out of the court house, and nothing to do but pile aboard lively, tickle the driver in the ribs business like, and tell him to keep the fog bell a-going and point for the harbour.
End of 8 Bad Men and True by Ralph Bergengren. Recording by Ruth Golding.